It's kind of crazy that this thing can do a lot of these things. That's pretty freaking wild, no? It's crazy. Okay, in this video, I want to talk about emulation handhelds and original hardware. Which one do you prefer, or which one do you gravitate to? I don't know. In today's world, there's actually so many emulation handhelds like this one right here, and there are a variety of companies who do this. And I want to talk about what's better, original hardware or these handhelds. So if it's no secret, in my videos, I post a lot of original hardware content. And that's because I really do have a passion for original hardware. But of course, I also modify the original hardware to make it better into today's standards. Ergo, a backlit screen on an IPS screen on a Game Boy Color. You guys know the Game Boy Color, it had a terrible LCD screen. You had no backlight, so you could not see at all. If you were in direct sunlight, you could see it, but in a dark room, you're shot out of luck. There's no way you're playing the game. So I like to modify things like this to make it better in today's standards. But of course, there are handhelds now that play this and other handhelds and consoles on one physical handheld. And that's like the thing everyone's grabbing. Of course, I have had this one for quite some time, and I don't even use it. I actually gave it to my brother. This is the Anbernic RG353V. Don't look into this. This is probably an out-of-date model. I'm pretty sure when I bought this, it was the day it came out, and next week they came out with a new one. That's the thing about these companies. They come out with new ones every week. I swear. You have Pow Kitty, you have our Anbernic, you have the Miu Mini company, you have Ayaneo, you have the Odin something, Aya something Odin. There's just a bunch of emulation handhelds, and then of course you have the Steam Deck now. But then that answers the question, what's better, original hardware or playing on these emulation handhelds? That's what I want to talk about. I don't have a definitive answer because it literally varies on the person. My personal preference is original hardware. I'm going to start off with that, but I also do like the emulation at times. I posted videos about emulation itself, and there are really good things about it. The great thing about this itself is, say you're traveling and you want to play a Game Boy Color game, you can play it. But if you want to play a Game Boy Advance game, you can also play that. I mean, if you want to play the N64 or PS1, this thing can probably do it. Not at the best speed, but it's playable. Of course, your Game Boy Color can only play Game Boy Color games. Of course, if you get the Game Boy Advance, you have a ROM cart where you can mod in Game Boy Color games as well. So I guess the Game Boy Advance can be modded to playing somewhat other systems, but nothing crazy like an N64 on the Game Boy Advance. It's not possible. But then you have other handhelds like the PSP. The PSP is actually, I made a video about it in my last video. You guys go check one of the corners. I don't know. I forget what side it comes on. But check out that video. I talk about what it can do in today's standards. I test all the emulation. I test what it can do when it's modded. A modded PSP can actually play its original games, PlayStation 1 games natively with no problems, and it can play up to N64. Sort of, you have to watch the video. But it's a playable experience for the PSP, and it's original hardware. Then you're jumping into the stepping stones of the 3DS and the PS Vita. I think those two models are probably one of the best original hardware, but also emulated handhelds that are when you mod them. When you mod a 3DS and PS Vita, the modding system is actually kind of cool. You can do a lot with both models, and especially the PS Vita. Do not sleep on that. I will make a separate video about the PS Vita itself. I really do believe it competes with these handhelds today, but another video on that another day. So here's the problems I have with actual emulated handhelds. For the most part, there are YouTubers that are dedicated to new releases on these handhelds. I would love to be that, but I'm not too intuitive with the actual hardware inside it. I don't know anything about the specs, the meat of the actual handheld. I literally just, if it works, it works. There are problems at times when you buy this from the store or Amazon, wherever you're buying your emulated handheld. If you're not tech savvy and SD card and computer approved and you don't know how to transfer files, sometimes these things can be a pain in the ass. Sometimes they're loaded with games and sometimes they're not. So you have to transfer those games and download those ROMs yourself for your backups. If you don't have that, you literally have to pay extra for an SD card. Some of the times when you buy these handhelds, the OS, which is basically the operating system, the thing it runs on, like iOS on the iPhone, sometimes the OS isn't good off the rip, so you have to download a custom firmware OS into this handheld. Believe this Ambernick is on the OG stock OS, and everyone says you got to go to one called the Garlic OS. I don't even know what that is. I'm looking into it. I've started to dig deeper into the emulation handheld. I've been watching videos. I will be grabbing a new emulation handheld that I wanted to test because it did catch my eye. So stay tuned for that. I'll make a video on that, and if it's good enough. So with that being said, if you don't know how to transfer stuff or download stuff into an SD card, there's tutorials on how to do it. If you're not accessible to a PC, you're shot out of luck. There's no way you can change the OS. Some games aren't installed in here, so you have to install the games yourself by putting the SD card into your PC. And like I said, you have to find those ROM backups and put it into the file. So there's another pain with this emulation handheld. Sometimes you don't get to play it off the rip. Sometimes you need to tinker with it. And a lot of these games are being run off of RetroArch. And if you don't even know what RetroArch is, that emulator itself has a bunch of settings that will probably confuse people who are new to the actual operating system. I get it. I'm still confused with RetroArch. I'm barely learning how to use the systems, its cores, its different video filters, hotkeys. It can be overwhelming for sure. So there are my downsides to the emulation handhelds itself, but most of the time they're pretty cool. Like this thing can play N64, which is pretty impressive. And I don't play with it. My brother plays with it. He's been playing Bomberman Hero, which is really cool because you can actually play that on the go. But then there comes down to the nostalgic feeling of an original hardware. Putting a Game Boy Color cartridge into a Game Boy Color is nothing but pure bliss. If you know, you know. It's beautiful. Just hearing the click. If the game doesn't read, you blow into the cartridge and it reads again. It's just a beautiful experience. That's why I always still kind of gravitate to original hardware, because it's just a nostalgic feeling. I grew up playing these handhelds. I modify them to today's standards, so it's more of a playable experience. Like this Game Boy Color here, it actually has a rechargeable battery. I don't have to ever replace the battery. I just got put a USB-C in and charge this thing. But here are the downsides to original hardware. If you don't have these items at home and you want to go into buying these things, you have to buy the games and the actual system itself, and sometimes these systems have spiked in price. I believe a Game Boy Color here in the States is roughly like a $60 to $70 sell, depending on the person selling the handheld or the condition it's in. So price is a big factor with actual original hardware. You have to put in money to play the games you want. It doesn't play all in one, but of course there are fixes to this problem. There are ROM cards for the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Advance, which are like 50 to 60 bucks if you want a good ROM cart, and it has all the games in there for you. Don't ever have to buy another game in your life for the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Advance. And I actually will make videos about those itself in another video also. I have plans to add more videos to the actual channel besides modding. So it comes down to rarity of how rare the system is. The Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, they're pretty expensive nowadays. Like some of these people sell them unmodded for like 120 bucks, depending on the condition, like I said. A PSP roughly is like an $80 to $90, depending on condition. Sometimes it can even range to like 130, like I said, depending on condition and the model. The DS is the cheaper side of the systems. A DSi can be modded, and you can put all your favorite Game Boy Advance games, SNES, DS games all into the DSi, which is actually pretty cool. And then the DS Lite, of course, has its ROM card, which is the R4 chip, and that plays all your favorite DS games and emulators like the Game Boy Advance and other games as well. So a lot of these original hardwares can be played with a bunch of games installed into it. So there's the questions like, why buy one of these when you can play on original hardware where it feels right and natural? A lot of these handhelds can only play up to Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color because the systems are very small, they're not strong, and there's not a lot of buttons on some of these handhelds. Like the Miu Mini has just the 4 buttons and the D-pad. So it can only play up to supposedly PlayStation 1. I have to grab one of those and check it out myself. But there are other ones that can play up to the Nintendo Switch. But there are problems to some of these things and its limitations, like the DS and 3DS library. I don't find myself wanting to play DS or 3DS on a one-screen handheld because it just isn't intuitive. It doesn't have the touchscreen, the stylus, be compatible with playing some of these DS and 3DS games. I can't play Pokemon Ranger on an Ambernick or an Odin or a Steam Deck. It doesn't have the same feeling, and some of these DS games require the stylus a bunch of times. So that's why I wouldn't really prefer DS and 3DS for these emulation handhelds. And sometimes the PSP resolution on these handhelds look atrocious and it doesn't even look appealing. So that's why I love playing PSP on its original hardware, because the PSP has some gems, man. You guys don't sleep on the PSP. Some of these games are stuck on the PSP and they're so much fun to play. But to me, it all comes down to personal preference. If you just want to play all the games in one handheld, then just get an emulation handheld. If you're a nostalgic person and love the retro feeling, then stick with the original hardware. There's nothing wrong with that. I have a Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance SP, a PSP, PS Vita, 3DS, I have it all. And I love playing on them all separately, and sometimes I'll gravitate to playing one of these, but at the moment I'm more on the original hardware side. But there's nothing wrong with emulation handheld. I was just curious into what a lot of you guys prefer, because it comes down to that question: who's grabbing original hardware and who's grabbing an emulated handheld? I mean, that's probably it for the rest of this video. I just wanted to talk and was wondering what's better, original hardware or emulated handhelds. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys prefer down in the comments down below. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button. Subscribe for some more content. I have a lot of other content that's informative, and if you were curious on certain things and certain handhelds, I'm planning to make videos on that as well. Comment down what else should I make videos about. I'm curious. And yeah, just let me know, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!